Welcome to this session of CNC tips and techniques. In this session, we're going to be taking a look at the next project of the month, which is a name puzzle. And as you can see on your screen there, it's a fairly simple project, but this technique, which is used for inlays, also can be used for creating signage. But in this case, we're going to make a simple children's puzzle using it. And although it's a fairly simple project, which is quick and easy to cut out, it actually involves several different techniques that we'll go over as we go through the creation of this. And so if you're just starting out in VCarve, you're going to pick up some little tips and techniques here, some things that you can apply to other projects. Some of the techniques we won't have time to go into detail, but there are certainly lots of other resources out there for learning VCarve, plus some of the other project of the month videos that I've done go into some of these techniques in more detail as well. So tonight, as you can see, it's a two-board project. We've got what we're referring to as the puzzle board, which has the pockets cut out in it, and then we have the letter cutout board for the letters that insert into it. On the machine for this project, I've set it up both boards on the machine at the same time. And as you can see, the letters are actually made out of 1/2 inch material, and the puzzle board itself is made out of 3/4 inch material. Of course, in VCarve, the way it's set up is you have your pockets that cut out the letters in the one board, and then we do a profile cut around the letters as well. Now, we use a special toolpath for this, which if you look at the upper right of VCarve, it's up here, it has an eye, and clicking on it, it opens up. It's called the Create Inlay toolpath. And that Create Inlay toolpath creates the male portion and the female portion. And there's two options in each of these. The one we'll be using tonight is called the straight inlay, and that creates these letter cutouts with the straight sides on them. The other one creates a stepped, which puts a flange on the bottom side. And if you use this female option, which has a through cut all the way, then that flange prevents the letter from pushing all the way through the back. So you could push it up from the bottom side. And it's used different ways in sign making, but some people will use a thicker material for the letter, so it actually protrudes partway through, but yet it stops it on the backside. And we won't be going into that technique tonight, but we will be using instead this pocket for the female portion, which is just as you can see here, it only cuts partway. And after you select these and you select your vectors, you get these two setups as well as two toolpaths. The pocket toolpath is the top one. That creates the pocket, and pocket inlay number 1 is the default name that it gives it. And then the male portion is called the male inlay 1, and that's the cutout or the profiling around it. I usually change these default names depending on the project I'm working on, and we'll do that later on tonight as well. But let's take a little closer look at what these two toolpaths represent and why they're kind of special. And you'll notice here, first of all, in the leg of the R, how that tool bit doesn't go into the quarter. That's partly because it's a 1/4 inch diameter router bit, and as such, it doesn't reach down to that quarter. But notice here how it overcuts the quarter and overcuts the quarter here. So what the inlay toolpath is doing, it's using the diameter of the router bit and defaulting to whatever fillet works for that router bit. And then if we look down at the insert part or the letter, it's doing the opposite. So here it's actually trimming off the tip of that leg, and it's clipping off that quarter as well, a couple parts. That way, these two parts then nest or fit together like a puzzle piece. So with that, let's look a little bit at the setup that we have here. You can see how, as I said, I'm using two boards set up right here. And we'll talk about how we set that up to cut two boards that are different thickness as we go through the project. In the job setup for this one, we're using a single job setup, which is 7 inches tall, but it really does represent two separate boards that, as you can see on my machine, I just stacked them right next to each other. Now, doing a single setup like this isn't the only way that you could set this project up. You could also set it up using layers in which you would have separate layers, one layer for the letter vectors and one layer for the puzzle pocket vectors. And as you can see here, the letters are blue and those are right there. You would turn those off and then just work on the main puzzle pocket, turn that one off, and then set up the toolpaths for the blue vectors, which are the letter cutouts. In this case, you have one single setup. This also would require, however, to set up your machine, the material, 2 separate times on the machine. So it's doable and it works just fine. I do find, however, the little extra work that it takes to set this up, it actually saves a couple of toolpath setups. But if you like layers, that's one way to do it. Another way to do it is to use sheets in which you actually set up a separate job setup for 2 separate sheets within your VCAR file. If you've not used sheets, it's a very handy setup when you have complex projects. For this project, which is simple and straightforward, I find it actually isn't necessary. In fact, in some ways, it adds a little extra clicking, but it is an option that's worth considering. And in this case, our puzzle board, as I show here, is set up on one, and then the letter cutouts is on the other sheet. But for tonight, we'll be using the single setup that we have laid out here. So with that, let's turn off some items here. And I'm going to start fresh. I am going to delete these toolpaths. And I'm going to delete all of those vectors. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and add the text, type in my name, and let's click over here and try that again. There we go. Okay, now I've selected a bold font, which is a good choice for doing puzzles of this type. Some types of fonts that you want to avoid would include a very narrow font. You'll have trouble getting your router bit, and these legs will tend to break off, especially if you're using solid wood. Now, if you were using something like plastic, that might work out. But generally, you want to avoid skinny fonts like that. You also want to avoid fonts that have lots of serifs on them. Certainly, these are overlapping, and that would have to be dealt with also. But this little serif right here that comes back, that would be a problem, because the router bit simply wouldn't go into that or cut that well. Plus, some of these skinny legs are likely to break off. So avoid fonts like that. This one may work out well, but we can consider here the fact that some of these T parts and some of these serifs on here might be fragile, again, depending on the kind of wood you're using. So just give it some consideration on that. The other types that you want to avoid is anything real creative like this. There's just too many parts in here to consider cutting out into a puzzle, or something like this. This rough edge probably would not translate well into a puzzle. Plus, it's all pretty skinny. So let's go back to our basic one up here, something bold and simple. And we're going to start with that. Now, for this setup, I'm using a 2.5-inch height for my letter. I find that on 3.5-inch material, that worked out well. Now, one other thing to look at is that if the spacing is okay, then you could just leave it like it is. If you choose to increase the spacing or decrease it, go back into the text tool, and by sliding your cursor down here, we see 2 arrows here. If I click on that, it'll bring those closer. If I hold the shift key down, I can then go further apart. So I'm going to add just a little bit of space between these. That looks good. This one I might go back to where it was. So just a tiny tweak on the spacing. Now that I have this part, I want to make sure it's centered left and right. And I'm also going to use the arrow keys of my keyboard and tweak it up just a little bit like that. So now I'm ready to go into my toolpath. The Inlay toolpath, opening that up, the first part we're going to set up is going to be the pocket part. And so I'm going to select my text and click on pocket. And it brings up what's called the female inlay pocket. I'm only going to cut partway through it, so that's 3/8 of an inch deep. I have my 1/4-inch bit set up. For this project, I prefer to use a down spiral because it leaves a sharper edge on the top edge for cutting. An up spiral can sometimes chip out that top edge. I'm going to use the offset, a climb cut again to minimize chipping. I've got a little bit of a ramp set up on here as well, and I've got, it's called the pocket inlay. Now I'm going to change the name of that and calculate that. Okay, we're getting this error. This sometimes pops up with vectors or fonts that have some sort of error within the vector. I'm going to click Go to Vector Validator. Now, not all fonts are going to give you this error, but this one is giving it to me. And let's see what's going on. I'm going to click Selected, and notice that it's showing me that there's an error right there in that R. So let's close out of this a second, and let's zoom in, see what's going on. And there I can see what's called a loop or an overlap. So that's kind of an oddity on fonts. I usually don't see that on these on fonts that are nice and clean like this. Now, to correct this, you would have to go into node editing. And if I attempt to do that, I'm then going to get this notice that said this is text, and the text must be converted to curves. Once converted to curve, the text will no longer be editable as text because it actually converts it to separate vectors. So let me just see if I can zoom out. Let me say no for the minute. Let me zoom out on this. And notice that when I select this, it's all solid lines. It selects everything. That's because it is text. It's a font. I can edit it. I can spell check it. I can change the font style. I can do anything I want to it right now. But if I attempt to go into node edit, it's giving me that notice to convert it. Now notice when I click yes, there we have all nodes, and let's go to the node edit mode for a minute. I'll exit that by double right clicking. Now notice that I have separate vectors. I no longer have text, which is fine because I like the layout I have. And now that I convert it to curves, I can go back and fix this one. Now here's a little technique that I like to use when I'm trying to match an existing design and I just want to fix a couple of nodes. I'll take that, go back out of node edit, I'll take that vector and I will copy that to a new layer, and let's call this layer red. Change the color to red, and I'm not going to make it active, but I do want it to be visible, and I click OK. So now you can see we have a separate vector. If I slide this aside like that, you can see we have a red vector and a black vector. Now I'm going to hit Control Z to put it back where it was. I also am going to go into layers, and I'm going to take my red layer and I'm going to move that up one level. And you'll notice that when I do that, it brings the black vector or the main puzzle vector back to the top surface. So the order over here affects how it looks on the screen. I'm also going to open up the options panel on the right side over here, and I'm going to lock that layer. That means that I will not be able to move the vectors on that layer or edit them. I just want those kept stationary. Then I need to reselect my puzzle vector because that's the one that I want to edit. Select it, go in, and let's node edit. And now notice that if I grab this, let's try and untwist this, see what's going on here. There we go. You can see the red node or the red vector underneath it. That's going to give me a guide to reposition these black vectors so that it's close to my original design. So for this, I'm going to pull that arm back. One of the things I'm going to do while I'm node editing is I like to switch off my snaps up here. So I'm going to click on these blue snaps and turn them gray. That way, those snaps, which act as magnetic points on the screen, it allows me to edit the nodes in a smoother fashion and things don't jump around so much. So let's also go in and I'm going to call smooth that point. that will connect these two arms. So if I move one, they both move. And then I can move that down close to the original. I could slide this one out, something like that. And for this design, I'm going to call that good. But you see, the red vector gives a guide behind it, but I'm actually editing my final vector. So let's double right click to exit node edit. And I'm going to go off and turn off my red layer and hide that. I could even delete it because I'm done using that vector, but I'll just hide it for now. Now let's select everything and let's try calculate again. At that time, you can see how it worked just fine. And if we preview that, you can see the pockets and they look good. So let's go back to our 2D view. Now at this point, I typically would just take and copy these and move them to the bottom. But there's another aspect that I want to show you of how, with some situation you might run into. So I'm actually going to delete those. I'm going to bring down this text setup because this text here is still the original text. Back to our design field and just verify that. You see it's still editable. So let's go back in, zoom in here a bit, and I want to add a little space back into these letters. So click there and click that one. All right, and then I'm going to center it, and the rest of the location looks fine. Okay, I'm going to open up this puzzle pocket again and select this vector. And in this case, I'm going to calculate it. But rather than go to vector validator, I'm saying continue anyway. I'm going to ignore it for now for two reasons. One is that when I go in and examine the results, and I look at this part right here, and I go back over here, and let's highlight that toolpath and look at that place where that little error was. You can see it's kind of ignoring it. It is going kind of over it. And VCarve has gotten really good at taking small errors like this in the vectors and finding a way to smooth them out. So in many cases, small errors like this don't actually need to be fixed. Now, we won't know until we actually cut this out to see how the fix is, but there's some things we can look at to determine whether this is going to cause a problem. For the most part, it's a very small variation. So in this case, I'm going to ignore it and just go with it. We're going to use it like this. Now, there's a second reason why I didn't correct that, because I want to stick with this font setup for a little bit. So now that I have that set up, I now want to copy the vectors or the text down to the bottom half. Two simple ways of doing that. One is I could go in and click on duplicate. And when I do that, it doesn't look like it has done anything, but if you hit the arrow keys in your keyboard, you'll notice that in fact it did create a duplicate. So there, that's the original one at the top, and then the duplicate is the one that we moved down to the bottom. So that's one way to do it. Another way, let's delete that, is to grab that vector, click once, click twice, click a third time, and hold down your mouse button, and then hold the shift key or the control key down, and then drag this down. And this is called drag and drop copying. It's really quick and easy. It's usually what I do when I want to copy something like this. Let go of the mouse, let go of the control button, and now you have a full copy of that. Now we're ready to go in to our inlay tool again. And in this case, we want to do the male inlay part. We're going to use the straight cutout. So we'll click on the straight. This brings up a toolpath setup that is really the same as your profile setup. Now in this case, because we know that this material is a 1/2 inch thick, that's how deep we want to cut. But because our job setup over on this side over here was set up to 3/4 inch material, VCarve thinks we're cutting 3/4 inch material. So I'm going to go ahead and do a start depth of 0.25. So at my machine, the router bit will drop down 1/4 inch and then it'll start cutting a 1/2 inch deep. So it'll actually work out and accommodate the fact that we have a 1/2 inch material on the machine. Once again, I'm using a down spiral, the same down spiral that I used above. And I probably set up to, let's just take a quick look at this. Yeah, I've set up about a 1/16 of an inch deep, probably change that speed to 20,000 and change the feed rate to 120 on this one. Next up, we want to add some tabs because, of course, we're cutting these pieces out. So let's click on tabs. And I'm going to use a tab length of 3/8 of an inch, a 1/10 of an inch tall, and a 3D tab. Having cut this project out already a couple of times, I found that this tab size works pretty well. Edit the tabs. Now remember, when we brought this text down here, this is still set up as text and as a font. We didn't bring down the curves version of this. We brought down the actual text version. And the reason I wanted to do that was because if you are doing this project and your font doesn't have any problems that require you to go into the vector validator and you bring your text to the bottom, you'll notice that when it comes time to put a tab in place, if I left click on this, we're basically going to get the same message we got before, is that this text has to be converted to curves. So we're going to end up converting this to curves down here anyway. So if either way you do it, you're going to end up having to convert it to curves at some point. So let's click yes. And notice how now we have vectors for this rather than the text. And now I can go in and add the tabs along the top and along the bottom. Depending on your project will depend on how many tabs you need and what type of material and such. But I found that for this particular project, using this material and this size router bit, this worked out well. So let's click close on that. And I'm going to add a little ramp to that. 1/2 inch should be fine. And then I'm also going to change this to letter and calculate. Take and preview this. And for the most part, it looks pretty good. We've seen the letter cutouts. Now, a little closer examination, you start to realize, well, I've got a couple of loose pieces right here, little islands. And they're pretty small, so they may not cause a problem, but there's also a way to deal with that. Also, I've got this, what I call a peninsula or a finger sticking down in here. I've got some peninsulas going up in these areas. And because the grain direction in this project is running, this is short grain. So these parts very likely could break off and jam against the bit and cause a problem. So it's worth dealing with those 3 peninsulas, and we'll also deal with these little islands right here, these floating pieces. And what we need to do in this case is part of the solution is going to be we're going to increase the spacing between these letters. So I'll split the screen so we can see what's going on here. And I'm going to take those 2 letters, select those, use the arrow keys of the keyboard, and click over a few clicks on those and put some nice generous space in between those letters. My board is wide enough to do that. Do the same with the ones on the left, a couple of clicks over. Let's click that R over a little further. And now I can take and recalculate this. Let's recalculate. Say OK. Let's reset the preview and re-preview that cutting. So now you can see in the bottom here that we've got nice pieces of material going between all the letters. So that's holding those letters together just fine. And those pieces are unlikely to break out at this point. But we still have this part inside the U. So the way that I deal with that is I go and get a rectangle. Let's turn on the preview on this one. And I'm going to draw a little rectangle right inside that U like that. Close out of that. And then go get a pocket toolpath. Do the same setup on this. Let's go 1/4 inch deep, then we'll cut a 1/2 inch deep. I'm using the same end mill, offset, some ramp. And while I'm at it, I'm also going to select that inside vector on this letter right here. And we'll cut that inside out, so that'll get rid of that little island or little floating piece in there as well. And then let's just call this pocket clean up. And let's calculate that part. And let's reset. And let's preview just the pocket cleanup. So there you can see how it's cleaning those areas up. Then we can do the letter cutout second. And now we have a nice clean setup. Now, if we take a look at the order on the right side here, when you save these out, we definitely are going to want to do the pocket cleanup before the letter cutout. So we're going to move that up in the stack there just to make sure that that gets saved out correctly. Now, notice also that the pocket cleanout, which is doing the inside of the R, the letter cutout is also doing the inside of the R. So we're kind of doing duplicate work there. So I'm going to open up the letter cutout, and I'm going to hold the Shift key down, and I'm going to deselect the inside of that R, because I actually don't need to recut that, having already cut it with that other pocket set up. So then let's calculate. Now let's reset. So notice how now it actually dropped the entire R. This is a little something I've come across. Some fonts, it'll do this on. Other fonts, it won't. So in this case, that little bit of extra cutting isn't a big deal. So I'm going to go ahead and reselect that inside and recalculate it. And I'll just accept the fact that we're going to do a little double cutting of the R. It's only going to be a small amount of time, so I'm not going to worry about it. And that way we have that toolpath set up. Again, like I said, some fonts you'll come across that. Others I've had where I've split the letters and it actually has worked. Okay, so with that, let's preview all the toolpaths. And things are looking good. Now, the last thing I like to do when I make a little children's puzzle like this is I like to add a little bit of chamfer around the top of this puzzle piece. It adds a little bit of decoration. It makes it a little easier to handle. And so it's a nice little detail to add. So to add the chamfer, I'll go back into my main drawing. And we're going to bring up the chamfer tool. I'll select the vectors that I want to chamfer, including the inside of the R. And for this setup, I'm using a 90-degree V-bit. I am using a 0.05 for the width and the cut depth, and an overcut, which makes the bit cut a little bit deeper on the edges and actually provides a little cleaner cutout around the edge. So I always add a little bit of overcut. Now for the chamfer type, we want this to cut to the inside of the line, as well as we want it then to slope upward. So that's the style that we want. You can see this pink line in the illustration here represents our vector. And let's call that chamfer, and we'll say calculate. And now let's preview that. And you can see how it's added a little chamfer around the edge. Now, one of the interesting things about how this works is that the chamfer, notice how the chamfer here is going square, even though the inside of our letter is rounded. And that's a little difference between how the chamfer tool path is working versus the inlay tool path. So there we have a nice little chamfer around the letters, and it just adds a nice little detail. So we now have all of our tool paths that are necessary for setting this up. Now, the last thing before, when it comes time to save these out, you want to put these in order. So I'm going to do the chamfering first. I'm going to do the pocketing going to move that to the bottom, and I'll tell you why in a little bit. Now, when it comes time to cut this out on your machine, there's one other thing that we didn't consider yet. And we're going to take a look at that right now. And it has to do not only with this order, but it really has to do with getting a good fit. And we talked about how the router bit rounds off the edges, but also notice how the router bit is coming right up to the line. So it's giving a very exact cutout, and the puzzle pieces will be exactly the same size. If you try to do this, you will find that these puzzle pieces will not fit into these openings. At best, you'd have to hammer them in or press them in really hard to get them to fit. Generally, they're not going to fit. So within the puzzle pocket, we didn't look at this, but there is an option called overcut distance. And this is an allowance that overcuts the size of the hole. What I found for this particular project was that an overcut distance of around 0.03 worked pretty well. You may find that you need to go up all the way to 0.05 to get the kind of fit you want for your puzzle pieces. By the time you finish them, and I used a water-based stain on mine, so that actually swelled them up a little bit. I added a lacquer for the top coat, which added a little bit of thickness. You want to make sure to leave room for that finishing. Plus, as a puzzle, you want these pieces to go in and out easily. Now, if you're making this as actually a sign that's going to be permanent, you could probably get by with 0.01 or 0.02 and just tap your pieces into place. But again, you may have to allow for your finish as well, even on a sign project. So in this case, notice when we zoom in, let's zoom in on this a minute. We're going to select that vector. I've added the 0.03 offset, and I'm going to calculate. And again, I'm going to skip that for now. Notice now how our profile is overcutting, the tool is overcutting the line, and that gives us the extra allowance for the part to fit in and makes it a nice loose fit, which is what we want for a puzzle, to be able to take those pieces in and out easily. And if we zoom in on this part, this also we can watch. If I preview that, you'll notice how those pockets become a little larger. There we go. Okay, so the last thing to consider here when you're setting this up, having the order correct, is that I'm going to save the chamfer toolpath out, obviously, as a standalone toolpath. I would go inside Save. I'm going to click Selected, and I'm going to save the chamfer as a standalone toolpath. And then I'll run that first. So let's just look at this here. Let's preview this. So I would run the chamfer toolpath first, just like that. But these three toolpaths can actually be saved out all into one file, one tap file, one G-code file, because they all use the same router bit, and then they can be run as one file. So it saves you from having multiple tap files for those toolpaths. In that case, you would go into Save, and you would select the second option, which is all visible toolpaths. That means they have check marks by them because they're actually visible over here. And when you save those, it'll save them all into a single G-code file that you can then run on your machine. And so when you run them on your machine, it'll run them in the order that you see here, which is important. And that's why we put them in this particular order. So we slow it down a little bit here, and let's run visible toolpaths. It'll cut the pockets out first. It'll then go and cut the letters out. And finally, it'll cut out the pockets on the top part. But then on the machine, I will pop out these letters at the bottom. I will then do a little sanding and trimming on them and fit them into the puzzle board above. But the puzzle board is still attached to the machine. That way, if they're too tight, I can go back and save out this puzzle pocket toolpath separately with a little larger offset on it to make those puzzle pieces fit better. Again, this will depend on your particular router, your material, even your CNC tolerances, and again, what kind of finish you're using. So run a couple tests with your project. Just do a couple of letters, 1 or 2 letters, to check out the kind of fit that you want. And then those offsets, you'll find that going forward for a similar project, they should work out just fine. So I hope you found this helpful, and I hope you enjoy making this project. We'll see you next time.